70 years ago, I first sat in this schoolroom in grade 1 and dipped Reenie Heel's braids in the inkwell that she sat behind me until she complained, the ungrateful wretch. I think her mother caught her braids when she was braiding them in the morning because they were beautifully braided hair, and saw the ink. And I was given heck by Miss Adamson, who was the teacher, and I can't believe if anybody had said to me that I would be here 70 years later addressing this august body of people, I'd have said, "You're absolutely nuts. There's no way that's going to happen."
Bush is up at the back. I said, "Just, you know, that's where we used to smoke."
The radio was a friend of mine, because on the radio there were programs for children in the 1940s. There was a program every weekday at 5:30 called Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, brought to you by Wheaties, Breakfast of Champions.
Yeah, 41? Yeah. Yes, and I had to walk down this long driveway, down Brooklyn Road, up to Cunningham's store to get the coach line's bus. That was what they used for buses to get us to school. And anyway, by the time I'd get there, I'd be crying all the way. My brother had a bicycle. He wouldn't wait for me. He rode off into the wilderness or wherever.
I can say that I never had a favorite teacher, but on the other hand, I doubt that any of my teachers ever considered me their favorite student.
We have our meetings second Wednesday of the month, 1 o'clock, and we usually have a speaker. I was just saying that the speaker next week is a woman who's going to talk about pelvic floor.
That day, we were told that we had to look after our little sister Barb. She was about 2 at the time. We didn't think anything of it. We'd spent all our time in the lake. We're always swimming. No problem there. We took her out to the beach, put her on the raft. Put the lock on. We were careful there. We locked the thistle buggy. It wasn't going anywhere. Then we shove off. We go punting around Elk Lake, down one way, down there. And then we come around Hamsterley Beach. All these mothers are there with their children, screaming at us, screaming at us. Well, we had the harness on her too. What was going to go wrong?
One game that all kids loved to play, and even the teachers would join in, and that was Ante-I Over. Anybody play Ante-I Over? Yeah, that was a great game. And the school principal office was jutting out from the back of the school building, so we could throw the ball over top of that. And that's how we played it.
Grant and I used to go to Sunday school together, and in the summertime, I mean, the collection plate used to sit up on the altar upside down, and we'd fill it full of grasshoppers.
I can remember my grandmother cooking Christmas dinner or any family dinner in winter in the kitchen. It would be so hot in the kitchen that you couldn't stay there, and yet you'd open the door and go into the hall and you'd just about freeze. I'd seen ice in that toilet.
What I remember about my grandfather, one thing that I really remember about him, he used to say, if you're hiring young fellows, young boys, 1 boy was fine, 2 boys were half a boy, and 3 boys were no boys at all.
To him, plants must be treated with the same respect as man, and this sometimes led him into trouble with his clients. Once a wealthy woman asked Richard for some plants that would require a great deal of attention. And after he asked her about her garden, he knew he couldn't sell her those plants. But why, she said, I've got the money to pay for them. You won't take care of them, the sale's off, Richard brusquely replied. On another occasion, he gave some blue cedars to his old friend, Canon Fred Comley, who was the rector of St. Michael's Church. A few weeks later, the clergyman complained that his plants were not doing very well. Well, you don't love them enough, Richard scolded. Love them and they will grow.
If you wanted water, you had to go out to a well, and the well was usually dry. My brother and I didn't complain because lack of water didn't bother boys. And
in dealing with history, I have found that some of the old families were quite quirky, and they ignored certain segments of the family, or they didn't talk about them. Whether they were out of sorts with them, I don't know.
And I eventually got so that I could milk the cow with Dad. That'd be when I was about 5 or 6, I guess, because Dad, having only one hand, he could only milk with one hand. And he would start the milking process on the cow, and then he would turn it over to me, and I could do 2 at a time, and then he would finish the job. So that's how the milking went on as long as I was able to assist him.
I spent grades 1 and 2 in said place of learning before moving on to the big building, the one that had 2 rooms.
Gary or I would have to go over, take the starter off of the car, bring it to the shop, blow it out, clean all of the carbon dust from the clutch lining, because the starter bendix wouldn't engage, it wouldn't start. So we would do that, oil it up, put it back on. The first time we did that, we charged him $2. The shop rates then were $4 an hour. So we charged him for a half an hour's labor. He came over, he was just as mad as a hatter. He said, for $2 you couldn't have done the job right. So from then on we charged him $4 and he was happy.
The school had no telephones at that point, but our phone number is Colquitt's 24R. And there were 10 people on the party line that covered everybody on Halliburton Road. So.
In 1866, a school was built at Royal Oak on a land given by the Rileys, but from what I've read before, it was Bailey's. So there's a bit of a contradiction in the information that you read. Sometimes it's Bailey, sometimes it's Riley. It burnt down and was reopened in 1883 with an increase in pupils.
So he got me a job working for Dr. Parazoo, and I was collecting crayfish, snakes, and newts and fleas off the dog. I used to get a nickel for crayfish, 10 cents for snakes, 10 cents for newts, and 1 cent for fleas. I should have got 10 cents for fleas because those suckers are hard to catch.
My dad lied about his age to join the Army when he was 16, so he could fight in the First World War. In those days, much thought was given to a regular wage and patriotic duty, while the real possibility of injury and death, at least with joining up, was dealt with by denial. Apparently this worked quite well until a man was in the trench and waiting for the whistle ordering him over the top.
We built like a 4x4 wall, solid wood, and she'd eat her way out of it. So my Uncle Frank, great Uncle Frank actually, he said he'd take her. So we bundled her in the truck and took her out there, and much to his astonishment, she was about to give birth, and the neighbor phoned and said, would you like to get your pig and all her baby pigs out of my basement? Because she'd eaten her way out of the pig pen.
Major Jukes and my father founded the social credit movement on Vancouver Island. And I used to hide. We had quite a large dining room table, and I put a basket under the table, and I would hide there in the basket so that I could hear the discussions. And as well, when Dad went off to Van Trite's to farm, the older, I guess the old, he would be 125 now, the Van Trite that I remember. I would hide in the back of Dad's Buick. He had so, because in the end I became a politician. And I was going to school, so I was going through the barnyard, up through the woods to go to school with my brother. And I came across a tree, and it had this thing up in the tree, and it had big black eyes and rings on its tail, and I was scared stiff, so I ran back to the house, and my grandfather stopped me and said, where are you going? And I said, well, there's such a thing up in the bush. And he says, it's just a raccoon. And he says, go back to school. So,
Yeah, she was also an entrepreneur. She would sell bread at a roadside stand right at the corner of the East Saanich Road and Cordova Bay Road. And she had, her kitchen was quite an old-fashioned kitchen. There was no counters in the kitchen. She had a huge big kitchen table, and everything was done on the kitchen table. Mrs. Paula Blank was a fairly robust woman. And you go in there when she was making bread, and she'd have a pile of bread the size of this table, and she'd be kneading it away. And she made all this bread and filled up her roadside stand. And I think she sold the little loaves for 15 cents and the big loaves for 20 cents, as I recall. But it was all on the honor system, just like it is today. And people would come along, buy their bread, and put their 15 cents in the little thing. So yeah, it was a good place to grow up. It was great.
When I first started school, they had a soccer team there. There were two soccer teams, and one was the Ford and one was the Chevs. And everybody wanted to be on the Ford team. But of course, my mother drove a Chev, so I had to be on the Chev team, and I don't think we ever won a game.
So before very long, and I don't think anybody here remembers it, sadly, I was appearing at Royal Oak High School in tailor-made drapes, 2717s, with a French seam down the side, usually powder blue, with a blue belt and blue suede shoes. And I imagined that I cut quite the figure.
The bit of pipeline road ran down to school. Now, I don't know whether any of you ever saw the old pipeline that ran down. Well, down near the school, it was under about 4 or 5 feet of soil. One day I had Johnny Chu come in, and he said, "We're going to be digging in that bit of land over there. Is that all right?" I said, "Do you know what's there, John?" Nothing there. About 15 minutes later, John came in, "Got to get them to turn off the water." And we had a geyser about 100 feet tall out in front of the school, running down beside the gym and out in the field.
I always like to give credit where credit is due. I had this wonderful teacher called Mrs. Gillenspitz. A lot of you probably remember her. And this, one of the major awards I got in school was my 40 words a minute typing award. And for a while I used to, and I don't know where the pin is now, but I sometimes, if we went to some function, I would wear it. It's a little white pin. And people would come up to me that didn't know me, and they would say, "Is that Order of Canada?"
"Hey, Ronnie," he called down, "can you back the truck up a few feet?" Now then, quandary. Do I admit I'd never in my life driven anything more than mechanical in a wheelbarrow? No, there'd be nothing to it, right? I started the countdown to reversing. Engine running, gear selected, handbrake off, clutch out. The little car lurched into action, roaring backwards at speed and colliding with the stilts of the rear of the bunker. The truck stalled. The bunker swayed frighteningly, its spindly legs rocking and twisting back and forth. The sawdust shoveler yelled. I cringed. Mark climbed down out of the bunker, came to the driver's window of the truck, and motioned me to get out. He never said anything to me as he climbed in, started the truck, and moved it ahead a few feet. But I could tell he was terribly disappointed in me.
The first council met at a private house on Glanford Avenue. That was the first municipal hall, if you can imagine it. And it was rented for $5 a month for temporary offices. And in 1907, a shed was built on the side to shelter the horse.
Well, I know in the late 50s, early 60s, the Women's Institute, we got one of those great big rolling pop machines where you slide the bottles through and then pull them out the end. And it was my job, any profit that was made from the pop machine, I could have for the profit. And so every night after school, I'd go and fill the pop machine, and then on certain nights, the people in the Women's Institute, I'd push this thing all the way across the street in the traffic into the Women's Institute, and then take cases of pop in and load it right to the gunnels, because they'd have square dances and things going on in the Women's Institute.
Certainly one of the biggest deals in a teenager's life is buying the first car. Like losing your virginity, it only happens once. Why did I pick this 36 Ford? Infatuation, I think. Even though it looked like what you see here, to me it looked like this, and it was all mine. It set me free, It gave me independence. I could drive to school or work or anywhere in my own car.
That the Royal Canadian Air Force enlisted a number of individuals in the area as spotters. Men and women who could take time in shifts and put on a pair of binoculars and track any plane that was up in the air. My mother was a spotter for the RCAF, and she wore a red blazer, which the hummingbirds loved, and she had a pair of binoculars, and she would spend her shift time 4 hours. But the men who were at Patricia Bay and Comox, they were training, and we had the Lancasters here in the Second World War, which were 2-engine bombers. And these guys knew her, Esther, and because she would phone all this stuff in, and they would buzz the hill and waggle the wings and hang out of the plane and wave at her. I thought it was just marvelous.
I had a strange feeling at one point in the research when one of the children of one of these generations married someone with the surname Piper in Suffolk, in one of the towns where I have Pipers in my genealogy. And I thought, uh-oh, Susan, you keep up with this, you're going to find you're related to yourself. You're going to find you're your own 64th cousin 3 times removed. That's what it's like with genealogy. You don't know what you're going to find, but it's a wonderful ride. It's a wonderful ride.
We had septic tanks, of course, in those days, and there was a fairly good slope running down through our strawberry patch, and we had one particular area of strawberries that grew the most magnificent berries you could ever see.
At the end of the report, it tells or suggests proper diet. You know, you've already had education, but this is the healthcare part. And it says that every child should be given plenty of milk, vegetables, cereals, eggs, fruit, and water. But it doesn't say anything about meat.
She could go to a movie and come home, and we could hardly wait to get the teapot going. She'd come in on that last bus, Wilkinson Road, at 10:30 with her hat on, not even taking her coat off, and we're all waiting in a sort of big farm kitchen for her to come in, and she would do the whole play for us, moving around the room and taking the voices. I mean, she was absolutely entrancing.
Our one summer activity that the teens in the area liked the most was roller skating at the south end of Elk Lake. Now, there's a lot of people around here that have no idea there was a roller rink at the south end of Elk Lake. And that was our favorite thing. Great fun, no booze, no drugs, lots of yelling, lots of flirting, and lots of laughing.
I do remember him coming over with his little glass jug, 1-gallon jug, and getting lawnmower gas, which we were able to dispense into glass containers in those years. It's illegal now. I don't know whether he actually did the lawn mowing, but he would come over and get his 1 gallon of gas. And on occasion he'd come by and fill up his car. And I remember one day he was standing there watching the numbers tick by on the gas pump, and he said to me, "I used to make money that fast."
But my first memories in this building was during the war years. The Second World War was on by this point, and we all had a gas mask, which was hanging on the coat hooks out on the wall. I don't know if any of you remember that. And occasionally we'd have air raid practices where they'd bring, well, I see the bells over there in the corner, and we'd all troop out and we'd walk across West Saanich Road and go behind Mrs. Blake's place, down into the gully where the railway tracks used to be, and we'd all lie on the grass there and wait for the all clear, and then parade back up to the school again. So,
by 1911, it had been established that a municipal hall would have its own quarters. The location of the hall was a hot issue for the election of 1911. Fred and William James Quick were instrumental in getting the hall located in the Royal Oak area. The site was located, and Mr. Durrance was given an option for $200 for his property across the road from his business at the Royal Oak Hotel. So eventually the property at 4512 West Saanich Road was purchased.
And like this one we're in now, here in Royal Oak, Strawberry Vale's first school was built in the 1890s. And like this one, it has survived the ravages of time and onslaught of well over a century of bad weather. It also survived the pressures of mindless demolition, especially widespread during the 1960s, when anything old was bad and anything new was good. The approach then was to get rid of any building older than 50 years and to replace it with a building lasting only 25 years, tops.
Cunningham's, I used to have lunch at Cunningham's from time to time. They never had soup, they had stew. It was tomato soup, but they put so many crackers in it, it became stew. And I used to take a couple of crackers, put it in, to eat my soup. His dad used to say to me, "Jack," he says, "put some crackers in the soup." He thought that I should get my nourishment that way, I guess. I don't know.
This story might bring a bit of humor to somebody. It certainly didn't bring it to us. One day, because it was a general store, it sold a fair amount, it had quite a drug line. Not drugs as we relate to totally, but it was a country general store. One day we found some chocolate in the drug department, or we thought it was chocolate, and we started handing it out. We gave it out to Ken Polson and his sister Audrey. We gave it out to Rick Chaffee, Jim, Alan, my brothers, Russ Lucas. His mom at that time owned the Toby Jug. Kids were running home. Mothers were phoning. What did you feed those kids? I think it was X-Lax. It was X-Lax. We had overdosed on X-Lax.
Some hunting for me on the internet and found some very interesting things. She gave to me some census records from England. The first one was in 1881, and lo and behold, in the 1881 census, I find a skeleton in the tailor closet. I find Eli and Mary Jane Taylor were living together. They were 28 and 27 years old. They had a daughter, Alice, who was 6 years old, and a son, William, who was 1. We also found their marriage records, and they've only been married for 2 years. And they have a 6-year-old daughter.
And somewhere in between all this work was the washing of many thousands upon thousands of clay plant pots. Yes, Sheila. During summer holidays, as a young child of 11 and 12, I took on this job with a school friend. It was all done in a very primitive sort of way. 2 large wooden tubs filled with cold, disinfected water would be set up on a platform in front of us. And here we stood all day washing these pots with our scrubbers, nothing more than a piece of burlap tied around a stick. The clean pots were placed in large wooden crates and set out in the sun to dry. And at the end of a couple of weeks, 2 very sunburned girls with very little skin left on their fingers would show up at the office door for our pay of $15 of each. $15 each.
You were like the Pied Piper.
Oh.
Richard, you were.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, everybody followed Shirley. Whatever Shirley said was fine. Really?
Really?
Yeah. You know, you had that little, you're sort of like Jesus to us. Only not quite that high. I can remember all through school, if you didn't have notes, you'd ask Shirley. Shirley would have the notes. If you didn't know something, you'd ask Shirley. And we all did this.
I don't remember you.
Yeah, I remember really clearly.
Oh dear, you mean I kept you on the right track? No.
Probably not.
In 1969, the municipality of Saanich purchased 33 acres to create what is called Quick's Bottom, which I think is an absolutely horrible name, as a wildlife sanctuary. I don't know how they dreamed that one up, but it's one that most people don't even want to talk about.
Washing the clothes was one thing, but the drying was a big problem. And everybody in those days, you had the wood stove in the kitchen. The wood stove did everything: heated the house, cooked the food, and dried the clothes on one of those pull-up racks. And pretty well everybody had those pull-up racks. And I always made your clothes smell like wood smoke and bacon and eggs, but nobody seemed to mind. I guess, nobody ever mentioned, you came to school, how come you smell like wood smoke? Nobody ever said that. Everybody smelled the same.
Who are my role models? Here, I think Carl Bonnell, pretty rough, but he was the one who I respected, and he offered all kinds of assistance. Morris Connor was another one. Both assistants as a teacher and as a friend.
I did have an interesting experience fishing there. There was three of us, and there's a creek that cuts off of Colquitt's, runs along Quick's Pond and across Markham Road and through the old mental home property up into urban. And from there it's just like a ditch along into urban. But the trout would go up there to spawn. And we'd gone up as far as into urban, and we hadn't caught anything. So we laid the fishing rods down beside the road and the ditch, and we had a friend, Jim Quayle, up on Viaduct. So we went up to visit him. When we came back, we had 3 Rhode Island red chickens on the worms. There was a great hoo-ha with the owner of these chickens. He wanted us to pay for them. Well, of course, we didn't have any money, and he kind of explained to him that his chickens weren't supposed to be out of his yard. So I think that was the day I learned why the chicken crossed the road.
They had only been there a short time when some well-meaning friend, in all good nature, donated them some bantams. Well, from there, more livestock. A cow for milk, more chickens, pigs for that much love ham we like, and my parents raised chickens from day-old layers until about 5 months old when they sold them to the egg farms.
And we would fish in a 14-foot clinker boat with a little air-cooled Kohler engine. In those days, you never fished with anything more than a 3-ounce weight and a couch and spoon or a small fly, and you never came home without your limit in fish. And in the late summer, September, early October, when the coho were running, that Sanishton Bay was 1.5 feet underneath your boat, was just a silver sea of fish. It was unbelievable. Whatever have we done?
These are a couple of opium bottles that we found on our farms because the Chinese workers lived there, and they, I guess they used opium and then just got thrown out in the garbage. So anyway, I did go through some garbage dumps in my younger days and found them.
I remember collecting silver paper. We would go out around the streets picking up silver paper from the old cigarette boxes. Across the street from the school was an empty field full of goats. And the seniors, which would be me, we would have to run across the street, get as much silver paper as we could before the goats ate it. And sometimes we would chase the goats off, and sometimes the goats would chase us off.
Now, the war was on. There was a threat from Japan, and the government thought they should camouflage the observatory. So I don't know how many of you have ever seen the observatory, which is artistically painted, has scaffolding all the way around. You could see it for miles. Yes.
The leaders that came into this community were generally from Great Britain. If you go through those early books, you'll see by the names, they were Brits. They were Irish, they were Scotch, and they have been in history totally neglected. And our history on Vancouver Island is incredibly interesting, but totally neglected. It's like Eastern Canadians writing about Canada had a blind spot when it came to British Columbia. Maybe it was the name British Columbia. Maybe it seemed like it was a different land. Yeah. And yet if it hadn't been for the type of people and the leadership that they showed in community, we might have been absorbed as Americans today. We might be just part of Oregon and a continuation up the coast up to Alaska.
the municipality received several bids, and they accepted one bid from a Vancouver developer who wanted to change the house to a micro pub, build an L-shaped shopping center, and have a McDonald's at the bottom. And we went, oh no, this is not going to happen.
The teacher told us that if you ever had a fire and you phoned for the fire department, make sure you tell the operator where you lived, because the operator hasn't got time to climb up onto the roof of the Colquitt Exchange and look for the smoke to tell the fireman where to go.
Now, rumors are that the municipal clerk used to retreat to the beverage house on warm days. He had a lookout at the top of the hill to watch for the buggy carrying a dignitary from Victoria or one of the elected officials might be approaching. Thus he could spend many a pleasant hour contemplating the virtues of bylaws.
Grandpa Walter had a Model T truck, which he used to travel from school to school, as his job made him responsible for doing minor repairs at many Saanich schools. Broken windows, wobbly desks, leaky taps, and the like were his territory, though by trade he was a cabinet maker. He had a small building for a shop at Royal Oak School, which was close to the road near the seesaws.
And in this little black book, I'm just looking here, they've got wages and insurance, Corporation of Saanich, building license, $5.50, D.A. Little. He must have been one of the workers because they've got July 8th to July 20th. Rithett Construction Limited Insurance.
As an aside, I wasn't one of the students who dreaded being forced into the school scene. On the contrary, I, full of curiosity, climbed a few steps up to the school door with zest and willingly went in. There inside and before me stood my teacher, who obviously wasn't the tough bird of previous years that my older cousins and my sisters had warned me about. Instead, there was Miss Lindsay, no doubt fresh out of normal school. She was young, maybe still in her teens, perhaps, and pretty. I looked her over. It was love at first sight.
Like anybody else, they had some problems with their neighbors. And a while ago, this letter was republished in a local newspaper. This is a letter that my grandmother and Aunt Annie wrote to Saanich Police about a problem they were having with the neighbors. May 21st, 1915. Dear Sir, I am writing to know if our neighbors, Mrs. Rudd of Burnside Road, cannot be stopped from tying her cattle so as to let them stray in the road on Eldon Place. All last summer we were annoyed by them at night as well as by day, and on complaining to them about the nuisance, we were simply laughed at for our trouble. Now it has started again. On going out by my front gate last night about 9 o'clock, I nearly fell over a bullock, which lay right across the gateway. There were 2 of them. This morning, up to about 9:30, there were 3 right in the middle of the road. Last week, there was a pony tied there and let stay there all night. Tonight, it's just 10 o'clock, and they have just tied up the cows again. We are disturbed nearly all night by the chains which are attached to them, and at times by their bellowing. Not only have they long lengths of chain, but there's a long rope which allows them to stray quite away. Cannot be something done to stop this? I can just feel my grandmother's indignation. I do not like making complaints about anyone, and I do not like being unneighborly, but I think we have put up with this nuisance quite long enough. Trusting this will be seen into, I beg to remain yours truly, B. Taylor and A. Harris. My grandmother was known as Belle.
Every Saturday, we used to get in the old 28 Chev and we'd go into Victoria to do shopping. And then we always stopped at the Royal Dairy on Hugh Street for an ice cream. And another time we were in the old 28 Chev and we were going down West Saanich Road in the summertime and there was a cock pheasant flew right into the window. So everybody's yelling, roll the windows up, because dinner had just arrived.
I remember the very last day in grade 6, I think it was Lou, Keith Cameron, maybe Jack. She lined us up for a group strap. Everybody stuck out your hands, but Lou and I were experienced, and Keith was too. You didn't stick your hand away out. You put your hand in a bit, and then you didn't get cut up here.
Our clothes. Well, as I recall, they were boot skates. They were strap-on skates. That certainly when I was, you had boot skates. When I tried, it was strap-on skates, and my ankles just didn't like those one little bit. I was not destined to be in the ice capades.
I started driving that farm truck when I was about 8 in the hayfields, and I'd have to stand up and hang onto the steering wheel to be able to see outside, driving between the haycocks. And gradually, by the time I was 11 or 12, I was driving the truck fully as you would drive it, taking great pride in double clutching and shifting and getting the revs just right and driving this truck around.
I waded in the Colquitt's Creek while the boys shot the raccoons and picked berries out for 70 cents a day out on the Old West Saanich Road, and of course swam in Beaver Lake. I guess I attended the annual Saanich School sports events, which happened on that enormous slab of cement that lay out in front of Beaver Lake. I don't know how many of you remember that.
Young Richard Pierce was the writer, and he explained how he was watching for Japs along the Pacific coast near his home with his wooden gun, because he knew that if the Japs ever landed, Just Mary would have to go off the air. Considering this was quite a compliment, she wrote a story about me, and she titled it, Richard, Corporal of the Mounted Rifles.
This is one of our milk bottles that was, we used to deliver milk to the houses. And when you look at the pictures of the Craigiely farm, there is a picture of a horse and a cart, and it had great big milk cans on the back. And they used to take those to the houses, and then they would dip into the big cans with the milk jug, and they would pour the milk into the jug that the customers put out.
I was taking art lessons from Mrs. Hobbs. She was known as Doris Lee Hobbs. And she inspired me because I didn't know I had artistic ability, but I could sketch and paint and draw. And she had great confidence in me. She just made me feel like I did have some gifts. So she had a huge impact on me.
And then there's the famous Mrs. Welch. Yeah, I had my fair share of the strap. And I remember one time two of us got sent up for the strap, and there was nobody in the office. So we took the strap out of the drawer, because we just happened to know where it was. And there was an old leather football there with the laces in it. So we unlaced the football and stuffed the strap in there, and she came in, she tore the place apart, never did find it. And there was always a rattle in that football after that.
1965, Lieutenant Governor George Perks did the honors of cutting the ribbon at the Saanich Municipal Hall. The new Municipal Hall on Vernon Avenue, completed in 1965, represents the large-scale and increased administrative function of the municipality.
Grandpa, like many who grew up in the horse and buggy days, never got friendly with cars. Grandpa drove slowly and cautiously when he came to a hill, which he would approach sedately and then rock fore and aft quite vigorously if he could help the car up the incline. Barb and I, in the back, rocked along with him and cheekily exchanged glances and laughed.
We always had wild soccer games up in the upper field over there, and you were never really sure who won, but it was a lot of the games just ended up in a free-for-all. And one kid would always get the soccer ball and grab it and get a chokehold on it towards the end of the game, you remember who it was, and he would get the ball, and that would be the end of the game. The bell would ring, and a lot of people would get the strap, and that was sports day.
Other people didn't do well with my mother. She wasn't afraid of anybody. So on. Anyway, she got a call. Dad answered the phone. Mother was asleep, so Dad woke her up and said, Bill wants to know if you can do it flat, fix it, yeah, okay, or change the tire. So, okay, so she gets up, loaded the jack on the truck, and headed to Maddox Farm. She said you couldn't see in the room for smoke, but you could see that there's a round table, all these guys are playing cards and drinking and having a great time. Asked for the keys for the car and went out, jacked the car up, took the spare out, put it all together. Probably took her half an hour. In the night, went back in, and Bill knew my mother quite well, and he said, would you like a drink? Sure. My mother could drink with the best of them. And as I said, smoke cigars. Bill said to her, what do we owe you for that repair? And there's silence, because somebody said money. Silent. So she just said, oh, I don't know, $5 would be okay. Well, there's a big uproar from, I'm not going to tell you who he was, but we've all known him. How outrageous it was to charge $5 to change a tire. Well, I'm sure, and as my mother said, she changed the color of the room by what she could say back to him. But she just walked over to the table where all the money was. She just went like this and pulled money to her and stuffed every pocket she had. And she told them, any one of you guys that wants to get this money back from me, we were wearing a tire iron around your neck. Nobody moved. She left. As they say, don't, if she says $5, pay it. Don't make a big scene out of it.
Well, Mrs. Walsh and I didn't really get on, and I hit grade 5 with Mrs. Walsh, and my mother and Mrs. Walsh did not get on. Two strong women clashed. And the last conversation I recall before being summarily moved to Cordova Bay School was a conversation between Mrs. Walsh and my mother that went something like this. Mrs. Walsh, he needs to see a psychiatrist. My mother, so do you, and if you'll go with him, I'll take him.
I found a little card on all these pictures, and it looked like it was on just a piece of cardboard. Always be kind to animals. It was in her handwriting, because we just put a whole bunch of stuff together. So, there you go.